like maybe we had someone standing on deer traps sending people over to Dickinson Hall. So yes, it's a wonderful thing. Thrilled to see so many of you come out. It shows me that you're reading your news brief, so you know what's happening and the good things that are here. So we won't take any great delay this morning to welcome our speaker, who's going to talk about quite an interesting story of his life. We've all read things about that period of time in history, but there's nothing more impactful, I think, than hearing it come from the mouth of the person who has experienced it themselves. So I have the good fortune of running the slide machine, so I'll be in here as well. And so I'm going to introduce you to Mr. Steen Metz, and we thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Marla. Can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
Okay. I'm absolutely overwhelmed and thrilled to see so many people here today on a nice summer day when a lot of people are on vacation. But it just proves there's tremendous interest, even though it's almost 70 years ago that we were liberated in the Holocaust subject. And I want to thank Marla and Anne for scheduling the event today. It's very important for me to talk to people. I talk to a number of students, of course, in the summer. I talk to more organizations like here, and this is a nice change of pace for me. But it's very, very important for me that we never forget that the Holocaust did take place. There are more and more deniers out in the world. You're all from the Chicago area, so I don't have to explain what the Northwestern Northwestern University stands for. But less than 10 years ago, there was a professor, would you believe he was a professor in history in Northwestern, and he denied that the Holocaust ever took place. I cannot imagine that with all the books, the witnesses, and so on. It's unbelievable. So that's why it's important for me. I want to make sure that the same thing doesn't happen to the Holocaust as it did to the genocide in Turkey around about 100 years ago. The Turks murdered 1.5 million Armenians in Turkey. That included my wife's grandfather. Today, in Turkey, they deny that it ever took place. Schools don't teach it. There are no books available about it. And of course, there are no survivors, like I'm a survivor of the Holocaust. There's no survivors left to talk about it. And that is very important to me. As a matter of fact, as a sideline, I was just on a cruise a few weeks ago, and I happened to be a person at the reception, and she was from Turkey. And I wanted some information about the Holocaust Museum. She had no idea what the word Holocaust stood for, which is incredible to me. I know I'm not totally objective, but Holocaust is a word that's used in all languages, so it wasn't a language problem. Holocaust is a story that needs to be told. It has been referred to as the worst infraction of human rights. I don't believe anybody will deny that, generated by Hitler, the bully, as I refer to him. And today, I'm going to share with you some of my personal experiences. I'm not going to talk a great deal about the Holocaust in general, but I think you'll rather hear some of my personal experiences. But, oh, that's okay, that's okay. I thought there might have been a signal there. I thought it was a little too early to start. But anyway, how can anybody deny that the Holocaust took place when 6 million Jews, including 1.5 million children under 15 years old, died? That's impossible. May I have the first slide, please? I also wanted to make sure, as I said, that we never forget that the Holocaust took place. And as part of my memoirs, about 3 years ago, I completed, this is part of my memoirs. I took all the chapters about Holocaust and put it into a separate book. A Danish Boy in Thereisienstad, reflections of a Holocaust survivor. And I wanted to make sure that when I'm no longer here, that everybody knew that it did take place. If anybody is interested, I have some copies if you're interested in buying it. Could you go back, please? Okay. Anyway, I want to get back to World War II, if I may have the next slide, please. I'm from Denmark originally. Here's a map of Denmark, and when I talk to students, I always ask them, is there anything specific that they notice on the map? And they always love to see over on your left to the west, Legoland, which is headquarters in Denmark, and the students always get a big kick out of that. You'll notice we border to Sweden to the east and to Germany to the south. At that time, during World War II, there were about a little over 4 million people in Denmark. Today, there are 5.5 million. Excuse me. I should mention, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, and I'm retired, so I have all the time that you have. But anyway, as far as Denmark is concerned, World War II started on April 9th, 1940. Germans invaded the border. There wasn't much of a battle. There was nothing little Denmark could do against the war machine of Germany, and Denmark surrendered very fast. It may sound like they were cowards, but in the long run it was probably a good idea, because if they hadn't surrendered, it would have killed thousands of people. The first 3.5 years in Denmark, things were relatively normal. I want to emphasize relative normal. It was relative normal compared to other occupied countries, like in Poland, like in France. As an example, in Denmark, we did not have to wear the Jewish star, which they had to do in all other occupied countries. I was able to continue to go to public school. My father was able to continue to practice law. Yes, we did have the soldiers with those awful green uniforms and the big boots walking up and down. But we were still able to go. I remember we were still taking summer vacations. And a lot of people have asked me, why were things different in Denmark compared to Poland and France and other countries? There are a number of reasons. As a matter of fact, there's so many reasons. There's a Dane who has written a whole book about it. But first of all, the Danish government, the first 3.5 years, cooperated to the greatest extent possible with the Germans, within reason, because they felt this was best for the Danish people. Also, the Germans loved the Danish food, and we used to export agricultural products to Great Britain. Of course, that stopped, and instead export was started to Germany, and also we fed the armed forces in Denmark. I just learned the other day, no wonder that we were able to export Danish food. Today there are about 5.5 million people in Denmark, and we have enough food to feed 11 million, so there's quite a surplus. Anyway, the situation changed dramatically during the fall of 1943. By that time, the resistance movement, the sabotage, had increased dramatically, and they were making life very miserable for the Germans, as they were supposed to, and they bombed many warships, they bombed some factories, bombed the rails so transport couldn't take place, and the Germans had had enough of it, and they went to the Danish government and said, this has to stop. We're going to have martial law, we're going to have a curfew, and you had to arrest all the people that was doing the sabotage, and they had to be sentenced to death. Of course, the Danish government couldn't agree to that. They surrendered, and that became the start of the final solution. But I just want to cover a slide here first. The Danish king, a number of myths about the Danish king. He was a big supporter of the Jewish people, and there's a lot of been written about it, that he actually wore a Jewish star. He did not, it's a myth, but there's no question he would have worn it if we had to wear a star in Denmark. But he continued in defiance of the German, the Hitler regime, his daily horseback ride. And you will see this is from 1940, you will see two soldiers saluting the king. And I love the way the king looks straight out and doesn't honor or return the salute from the Germans. The final solution started in the fall on October the 2nd, 1943. Before I talk about the arrest, I should tell you, and I'm sure you heard about that, 95% of the Danish Jews were able to escape to Sweden. You remember from the map, Sweden was located very close to Denmark. There was unbelievable story. There were more Jewish people saved in Denmark than any other country, occupied country, except maybe Bulgaria. And they managed to go in fishing boats. They paid the fishermen to sail them to Sweden. There have been a number of books written about it. I would have personally, and again I'm not objective, I would like to see more books written about the people that suffered in the concentration camp. But 95% of the Danish Jews, at that time there were about 7,000 Jews, they managed to escape to Sweden. As a matter of fact, there were a number of children among them, babies, and they were afraid that they would scream, and they sedated those children. And as a matter of fact, a couple of months ago, I met a Danish person who was a little baby at that time, and she was sedated herself. But the Germans thought they had the perfect plan, and the night between October 1st and 2nd, which also was Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year, they started arresting Jewish people all over the country. Why were so many people able to escape to Sweden? People in Copenhagen had been warned a couple of days earlier, and that's why the Germans didn't find very many Danish Jews in their homes. They had figured that on Rosh Hashanah that everybody would be home celebrating. We lived in the middle of the country, and we had not been warned. So early in the morning of October 2nd, a couple of Gestapos pounded, not knocked, they pounded on our door. I can still hear the sound. My father answered the door, and I had no idea what was going on. I was not brought up in the Jewish faith. As a matter of fact, I didn't know I was Jewish. My father was brought up in the Jewish faith. My mother was not. And I went to public school. And I didn't understand, why did the Gestapo come to our door? Why didn't they go to the neighbor's door or some of the other people in the building? Was it a crime to be Jewish? I don't think it was a crime, just happened to be born Jewish. But of course it was a crime in Hitler's eyes. And we were arrested. We got about half an hour to get ready. And my mother and I would my mother rather asked if we could go down to the bakery. We lived on the third floor. The bakery was downstairs at the street level, and the baker gave us a lot of pastry and rolls to take with us. We knew the baker very well. He also asked if he could help my mother and I to escape. Technically, theoretically, it would have been possible. There was a corridor in the basement, and we could have walked around there, and we possibly could have escaped. Of course, my mother could not agree to that, because my father was hostage upstairs, and he would probably have been shot in the spot. So we were arrested, and on the next slide, you'll see the wagon on the left. We were transported into the center of town. The town's called Odense. I call it Odense, you may call it. Anybody have been to Denmark? Oh, quite a few. Did you go to anybody to Odense? Odense? Oh, great. Hans Chris, that's where Hans Christian Andersen is from.
Just the three of you in this family?
Pardon me? Yeah, there was just three others, and thank you for I should have explained that. My father, my mother, and myself, and I was 8 years old at the time. and we were transported into the center of town. This picture was taken of a person over here from the balcony, and it's supposed to be the only picture taken of the rest of the Jewish people. I'm in there, I look with magnifying glass, but I cannot recognize anybody. Anyway, later on, we were transported in the same wagon to Jutland on the west coast, and I'm sure this is a familiar picture for many of you. Historians call it the boxcar. Most Holocaust survivors, like myself, we call it a cattle car because that's what it was. We were transported, we were herded into the boxcar. We spent 3 days and 3 nights in the boxcar. It was dirty, there was little hay at the bottom on the ground. There was no lighting, there was no benches, there was nowhere to sit, there was no bathroom facilities. And can you imagine the smell and the humiliation, the embarrassment, being there for 3 days and 3 nights? We had 1 break, we got out, got some fresh air, no food, no liquid. We shared the food, everybody seemed to have had some food with them, and that was all shared. There were 4 children like myself, I was 8 at the time, and we were able to lie down. There was not enough room for the rest of the people to even sit down. They had to alternate sitting and standing. And it was very, very uncertain. We had no idea where we were going to end up. And obviously after spending 3 days and 3 nights there, we knew we would be far away. And eventually we ended up, at that time it was Czechoslovakia, today it's the Czech Republic. And from Denmark to Czechoslovakia, the camp we were in, the German version is Thereisienstad. Thereisienstad is the Czech version. It's about 550 miles. And as I said, it took us 3 days and 3 nights to get there. And if I may just have the next slide. That's the train station on the left. On the right, the train station was about 1.5 miles from the camp. And here's a picture of Jewish people walking into camp. So as soon as we arrived, the Germans, the Gestapo people, examined all of us, took all the jewelry, the money we had. And this was after my father was encouraged by the Gestapo to take as much money as he had. My mother was encouraged to bring jewelry, not that she had very much, but that was just a sign of things to come. That's the way Hitler and his people operated. They tried to intimidate you any way they could. They abused you, whether it was physically or mental. There's many ways of abusing. So after that, we were sent to our barracks. I'm often asked by the students, do you have a number on your arm? I don't. The perception is that all Holocaust survivors have a number. The people that have a number on their arm are the people, and there are well over 1 million, and very few survived, the people that went to Auschwitz and the complex. They all had a number. They were also shaved and wore those, as I call it, pajamas uniforms. So, we were housed in, if I may have the next one, please. This is where my mother and I lived. The women lived in separate barracks, the men in separate barracks, the seniors in separate barracks, and an uncle and aunt and their little son who was younger than me, and my father's mother also ended up in Thereisienstad. As a matter of fact, they had been warned, and they were on the way on their way to Sweden. But unfortunately, it didn't happen very often. But there was an informer or traitor that told the Gestapo about them, and that's how they ended up in Thereisienstad. But unlike the other occupied countries, there are very few Nazis and informers in Denmark, certainly compared to the Netherlands and Poland and France, where local people, Nazi people, actually helped arrest the Jews. But this is a good illustration of where we lived, up on the loft, slept on in bunk beds, straw mattresses, very little straw. I still remember all the lice, the fleas, had to scratch myself. I didn't know exactly what was going on. It was very, very uncomfortable. We were there starting in October. It was very cold during the winter, being so high up, and it was very warm during the summer. Everybody in Thereisienstad worked 24/7. We were slaves. My father was exposed to some very heavy road work, construction work. He was used to office work, being a lawyer and litigation, and this was just, the work was just much too hard for him. And I heard witnesses, some younger people. My father was actually 40 years old at the time, so he was a very young man. And younger people that helped out with the construction witnessed that my father was physically abused. He was whipped. He wore overcoat, a winter coat, to keep warm. One day a Gestapo came over and tore it off his back. You don't work with an overcoat. He was trying to keep warm. It was too much for him, and he lost about half of his body weight. Eventually he was transferred to an infirmary, and they had great doctors there, but they were not able to help him. They didn't have the material, they didn't have the medicine, and he died, unfortunately, of starvation, malnutrition after less than 6 months. Typical German-Russian fashion. The certificate, obviously, they were not going to say he died of starvation, and they put it on as he died of pneumonia. I'll skip that. No, let's just see. I went back to Thereisienstad in 2006 to do research on my book. I remember my wife was very concerned. My wife Eileen was concerned that I would get nightmares afterwards, but fortunately that didn't happen. And in the archives I found a certificate with my father's name. While we didn't have numbers on our arms, you see Roman numeral 25 was indicated the transport from Denmark, and 1 was the first transport from Denmark. And my father's number was 52, my mother's was 53, mine was 54, and some other bad on it. Let's go to the next one if we could. Oh no, just go back, I'm sorry, let's go back to that. I want to talk more about working in Thereisienstad. My mother also worked. She worked in a factory. They used a mineral called mica. I'd never heard of mica. I'm sure not too many people have heard about it. It's a mineral that's used as insulation material for the planes, and the Germans had very cheap labor. There were several hundred women working in a factory. There was a bench in front of them, and they were sitting there filing down the mica, trimming it into layers. That was one of her jobs. One day, a Gestapo officer came in and asked my mother how she was doing. It was right after my father died, and she said, "Not very well. My husband just died." And of course, the Gestapo officer asked, how did he die? My mother, very innocently and rightfully so, said, "Of starvation." Apparently, you could hear a needle drop to the floor. It got so quiet, her co-workers came up to her and said, "How could you say that? They could have shot you," but it was the truth. But just to prove there's more than physical abuse, there's mental abuse. And that same officer came in the next 7 days and asked my mother the same question, and now she said he died of starvation. Another example of what I would call mental cruelty, another job my mother had, she worked in a factory, another factory, cleaning floors. She had finished. There was a bucket of dirty water standing there. An officer came in and got a big kick out of, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say kick here, but kicking the, no pun intended, kicking the bucket, so to speak. That's what he did, so all the dirty water was back there, so my mother had to do it again. That's the way they behaved. I was only 8 years old at the time, and I also worked. I didn't have to work. My mother had to work. My father had to work. But my mother, after thinking about it, thought it was probably a good idea for me to do some work that would help time pass by. So what does an 8-year-old boy do? I was a messenger. I was a gopher. And when I talked to students, I always had to remind them that things were very different in those times. We didn't have computers, we certainly didn't have iPhones, and we didn't have access to any communication in the camp, only the rumor mill. So my job was to go from one German Nazi office to the other in the back, accumulating all the documents and taking them from one place to the other. And it was about 3 or 4 hours a day. The official language was German. My mother and father spoke some. I didn't, so I couldn't understand what was going on. On my way, I passed the cafeteria, the kitchen. I passed the kitchen, and the dream job, of course, if there was something like a dream job in a camp, would be to work in the kitchen because you could get extra food. None of my family worked in the kitchen, but when I went by the kitchen, I saw a number of bags of raw potatoes, and I would very carefully look around and to make sure there was no German soldier close by, and I would help myself to potatoes, to 2 or 3 or as many as I could have in my pocket, raw potatoes, and I guess technically it's stealing, but as far as I'm concerned, it was not stealing. It was trying to help exist. Brought them to my mother. And I still remember my mother telling me when we got back, she was very concerned that this would be part of my habit, that I would become a kleptomaniac, being such a young boy at the time. But that didn't happen. Food. I can cover very fast. We got some coffee substitute for breakfast, Thereisienstad coffee, with some dark bread, occasionally margarine. May I have it? For lunch, we were lining up. This is a great illustration. We were lining up for soup. It was called soup. At least it should have been soup in quotes. It was boiled water. The potato peels. We would line up with our bowl and our spoon for about half an hour, maybe up to an hour. And here's, you can see the lineup. They had big kettles of soup, and all of us wanted to get the soup from the bottom to get some of the potato peels. In the beginning, I didn't want to eat it. It was just terrible, but of course that couldn't happen, so I started eating it very fast. For dinner, For dinner, this will repeat itself. We will line up for soup and some dark bread. Occasionally dumpling. We got dumpling, but food was at a premium. And I heard later on that if you had food, it was like gold. It was the gold standard, and you could get just about anything if you had food. What happened was that after about 6 months, we were allowed to get parcels. And we got food parcels from the Red Cross, from friends and relatives. And they started arriving, unfortunately, right after my father had died. And without those parcels, I just don't know how we would have been able to survive. Everybody in camp, everybody was allowed to get parcels. But the Danes probably got more parcels than from any other people there from other nations. why was that? Because we had a great support system for the Jews in Denmark that didn't exist in the other areas, and we probably had more food, even though it was rationing in Denmark and other countries. Somehow they found a way of getting us some food. So that was, without it, as I said, I don't know what would have happened. So what does an 8-year-old boy do in the camp other than work? I played soccer, and I played in we had a gravel field because we didn't have a real soccer ball. My mother and other mothers, they were very creative. They took old racks, bound them together, and that's how we kicked the football. I played with people from other countries. Most of the people, I should tell you, from the camp, there were very few Danes. There were 472 out of 7,000 that were in camp. And of those, 53 died, most of them from illnesses or starvation. Most of them, like 43 out of the 53, died during the first 6 months before we started getting passes. There were other Czech children, there were people from Holland, and we really bonded. And my mother told me about it. I didn't realize at the time. It was just natural for me to play soccer with Czech children. But whether you were Dane or Holland, from Holland, we all bonded. My mother would have good friends from Holland and from Czechoslovakia. So one day I got back and I was very sad. And I told my mother that what happened to those, if I may have the next one, what happened to those Czech children? My mother said, oh, I'm sure they were ill, or they'll be back in a couple of days. She was hiding the fact, and I didn't realize it. I was, as I said, 8, 9 years old there. I didn't realize those dreaded transports took place. Thereisienstad was a concentration camp, but it was not an extermination camp. And there were thousands of people that were sent in transport in those cattle cars. You see the Gestapo officer there. This is a good illustration where they were herded into the boxcars. And my mother was trying to hide. I didn't know that it existed. So this is where those Czech children ended up. And of course, very few people survived Auschwitz. And they were just, I've been told, because I wasn't there at the platform, there was just dreadful scenes. People have often asked me, how did they select who should go to in transport? And of course the Germans, the Nazis, they were in total control of the camp. But they appointed an administration led by all the Jewish people, led by an Jewish elderly. And when they needed people, he would say, we need 2,000 next week, next day we need 500. And they had to come up with the names. It was just, I cannot imagine how anybody could do that. They would get notes at night, and they had to show up. And it was just dreadful. As a matter of fact, these elderly apparently didn't do the job well enough to satisfy the Nazis. The first one was sent to Auschwitz, where he died. Another one was shot in Thereisienstad. So that was just a terrible job. I mentioned that I went back to anybody been to Tellison or Thereisienstad? Pardon me? Oh, you've been to Dachau, yes. I went back in 2009, as I mentioned, and I went to the museum, and I was so moved when I got into the museum. The museum was built where the children used to, their barracks, and there were names of 50,000 children that passed through Thereisienstad. They were all inscribed either on the wall or on the ceiling. You can see my name on the 4th line, Metstein 5535. This was a picture Eileen, my wife, took, and it was very moving standing there. It's just hard to imagine that most of these poor children, they didn't survive, and they died. Next one, please. Thank you. When I was in camp, the Nazis had the Jewish people build a crematorium. There was not enough room to bury all the dead bodies. And they started burning, cremating the Jewish people, including my father. And one day, a number of children, including myself, were summoned to form a human chain from the crematorium to a river. And they had boxes of the ashes of the people with a name and number on them. And they were passed from one person to the other, including myself, and eventually thrown into a river. I don't know if you can see it in the background, but there's a river there. And when I went back, this is a memorial, which doesn't mean much to you, but means a lot to me, because that's where we were standing, and eventually putting the ashes in the river. It's hard to imagine, but there were no fewer than 25,000 boxes. And a Danish friend of mine, who was a few years older, and I didn't realize at the time, he was standing next to me, and he wanted to make sure when I got the box that the name and number were on the other side, so I wouldn't see my father's name. But I mean, he was probably 11 or 12 years old at the time, so that was amazing. A couple of other incidents I like to talk about. I was a growing boy, and I ran out, and my shoes were getting too small, and I needed shoes. And there was no department stores, there was no shoe stores. So how do you get shoes? My mother bartered with a Czech lady. The Czech lady wanted some good old Danish butter, and my mother wanted some shoes or used shoes, and I wore them for the rest of the time. A few months ago, I contacted, it was a friend of my mother, she was younger, and she's still living in Denmark. And I talked to her and told her that I was starting making talks. And she said, oh, we played cards in Thereisienstad. So I said, where did you get the cards from? She said, and this is apparently the truth, you could get just about anything as long as you had food. So food was truly, the gold standard. Excuse me just for a second.
Dean, did you play bridge in Thereisienstad?
Did I play bridge? No, I didn't know. I didn't know. It's one of my bridge player friends here. Yeah, no, I didn't. It's good. But you may have heard Thereisienstad referred to a model camp. It was not a model camp. How can it be referred to as a model camp? There were 140,000 people that passed through camp. 80,000 of them were in transport to Auschwitz and other extermination camps. Very few of them survived. There were about 35,000 people, inmates, that died in camp. Most of them starvation or illnesses. And towards the end, there were only 17,000 in camp. I should mention it was very tight quarters. It was an old fortress with brick walls around, with barbed wire, so it was almost impossible to escape. There were people that managed to escape. I don't know how. There were more people that got shot trying to escape than managed to escape. And I lost my thought. I'm sorry. It'll get back to me. But anyway, there was so many people there. It was a fortress that was built for 6,000 people. At one time, there were up to 60,000 people, or 10 times as many as was built for. And when the number got high, what happened? More transports. That's the way the Nazis operated. But anyway, Danes, big supporter again of the Danish Jews, they wanted to find out what was going on in Thereisienstad. And at first Hitler and his regime said, no, we're not going to show you what's going on. Then they thought they had a very bright idea. yes, let's get an invited international delegation to Thereisienstad, and this would be a big propaganda. We would beautify Thereisienstad, had all the inmates working hard, cleaning up. They built fake storefront. If I may, I think it's on the next slide. This is a great illustration, and this is of course not the way Thereisienstad looked like, but this is what they prepared as propaganda. Fake storefronts, a pavilion and music, new benches, not new, but benches. We had never seen benches. And there were grass on it and flowers. They also had sinks in the stores. Of course, what people didn't realize was that if you turned the tap, there was no water, there was no plumbing, just another fake. And we cleaned, we painted. When I say we, the inmates, I don't mean myself. And there were too many people in camp. They wanted to show some of the people that were not too frail, not too old. So they sent more people in transport to extermination camp. Big hoax. And this is why sometimes Thereisienstad is referred to as a model camp. It was a model camp for one day only, and that's when the international delegation included 2 people from Denmark and 1 doctor from Switzerland, and they spent 46 hours, including lunch, in camp. It was really like a play. I refer to it as a play. The directors of the play was the Nazis, the actors, the actresses were the inmates, and the audience were the delegation of 3. I know it was a very small audience, but I think that's a good way of describing it. And they didn't see Thereisienstad as they would normally do. They even had the nerve to import some healthy French children that played on the playground. They looked healthy, they had nice clothes, and I could go on and on like that. They couldn't see through it, and we had been told in advance, don't talk to them, don't ask any questions, and we were told that you better be quiet. The delegation was constantly accompanied by 1 or 2 Gestapo. It was a very carefully outlined route they took, and eventually they went back and told people it wasn't too bad. Thereisienstad wasn't too bad. Of course, they didn't see the real camp. Some people said, and historians have written that they couldn't go back and tell people that it was terrible because the Danes would have been sent in transport. That's possible. Of course, I'm not totally objective, but even after the war, it was pretty evident from interviews and papers that they didn't realize what took place. So we'll move forward to some happier times. And on April the 15th, 1945, the Danes had managed to persuade Himmler and his regime with some help from Sweden. Sweden, if I didn't mention, was neutral. That's why so many Danish Jews could go to Sweden. And they sent the white buses down, Red Cross, the Swedish flag and Red Cross painted on all the sides. I'll never understand how they were able to persuade the powers to be, but I'll be forever thankful. There was a convoy of about 20 buses, and there were motorbikes in front. It couldn't be Danish buses because Denmark was still occupied, so it had to be from a neutral country like Sweden. And those drivers, they were very, very courageous. The war was still going on. The Soviet troops were coming in from the east, the Allies from the west. There was heavy bombardment, and we didn't believe it until the buses were there. We had been told by the chief rabbi that we would be liberated. It wasn't just Danes, Scandinavians, not just Jewish people, but communists, policemen, Jehovah's Witnesses were also liberated. And I still remember the drive through Germany, heavy bombardment. I could hear the noise. We had to stop in the forest for several hours. We had curtains on, but I looked out and I remember seeing the young soldiers. I mean, they were teenagers. They were 15, 16, 17 years old. They had run out of the adults. Very sad sight. And eventually we arrived in Denmark, and you would not get a welcome like that in Netherlands or Poland. But row upon row, welcome is just like when they received it, when they came to Thereisienstad, we got more chocolate and food and flowers. We got a very, very warm welcome. We were 3 days on the way. We could not stay in Denmark because Denmark was still occupied. And we went on to Sweden. We arrived in Sweden on April the 18th and spent a couple of weeks in quarantine. They wanted to make sure that I didn't get any illnesses into the country. And on May the 5th was the day that that the Germans capitulated, and that was the official V-Day. It was different in other countries, but that's how it was in Denmark and also in Norway. We were not there, but Denmark celebrated as never before. And the Danes probably used the flag more than anybody else, and there was a flag, I understand, everywhere. I've seen pictures and films of it, not just on the regular flagpoles, but planted in the yards and in the windowsills. Even today, they still have candles celebrating that day in the windows. And ever since then, they have been flying the flag on May the 5th. And that being my birthday, I of course tell everybody that they're celebrating my birthday. Just a couple of comments, and then we'll open up for questions. I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time, but sometimes I get carried away and I like to relate my experiences. But eventually my mother and I got back to Denmark. We sad without my father. We went back to the hometown. There was a teacher that took me under her wings, gave me some private lessons. In Thereisienstad, there were no schooling allowed. I got some private lessons from other people, but no official school. And I didn't realize at the time, I was too young to understand it, but she was probably testing me as well as teaching me. And fortunately, I passed her test. And even though I hadn't even gone to school for almost 2 school years, I was able to go back to my old classmates, which was very important to me. My mother, our apartment, I'm often asked, what happened to your apartment? It was rented out. Denmark has always been short of apartments. Our belongings were stored and taken care of by my father's company. And we got most of the belongings. We lost a few things, but including a valuable stamp collection of my father's, but that's a small price to pay. So I graduated from high school in Denmark. I went to commercial college. I joined a Danish company, and they sent me to England and Canada, where I met Eileen, who's from England, and we got married in Canada. And I've been in the United States for about 50 years, and I retired about 15 years ago. And I've been very fortunate. My mother really tried to shield me and to help to forget about it. You'll never forget about it. You certainly will never forget. I read an article some months ago about a Holocaust survivor who had forgiven the Germans. I don't know, but that's her opinion. In my opinion, I think most other survivors are quite different. But my mother tried to shield me. People would ask, friends would ask what happened and how, and so on. And my mother always said, ask me. And so again, we never forget it. And we didn't talk about it in the family, very little with my mother, which is typical Holocaust survivors. A Holocaust survivor, I still don't want to talk about it. And I wish I could wake up my mother for about half an hour, questions to ask her. But I didn't talk, as I said, about it, and very much about it, and even some close friends of mine didn't know what had happened to me and my family. But about 8 or 10 years ago, I was retired at the time I started. I wanted to write my memoirs for my family and close friends. And I didn't realize that I would include a lot of chapters about my Holocaust experience. I did a lot of research, talked to people, internet and so on. So a separate book I self-published about Thereisienstad. And that's really when I started opening up. And I think it's very important. I like to think it's healthy. And a major mission of mine today is to talk to groups like Assemble here and to students. Because I always ask the students, I'm going to ask you the same thing. You're my ambassador. I'm asking you to pass on the message to as many people as you can. And there's a flyer, maybe this is a commercial message, but it's not meant as such. There's a flyer back there, and I'm going to talk at the Holocaust Museum in Skopje on August the 10th. And if you have friends that might be interested, please take a flyer and ask them to come. So again, my major mission today is to pass on the message, and even bridge. There's some bridge players in this room, and bridge is a great passion of mine. But I have been known to cancel. My partners know that I've been known to cancel bridge games because this is my high priority today. And I think it's helped me get closure, and maybe it's also been therapy for me. So I really appreciate being here in so great numbers, and I welcome questions, and I hope you have many questions, and I try to answer them as honestly as I can. And I have all the time you have, unless the room has to be used for something.
Okay.
Okay. Yes?
What was the attitude of the German soldiers? Did any of them comfort you, or
What
was their feeling towards you?
The question was, what was the attitude of the German soldiers? I never saw anybody who would help us. Maybe some of them did, but they were cruel. And it was normally the SS, and it was all part of the Nazi regime. And of course, they only did what they were told to do. And of course, that was an empty excuse as far as I'm concerned at the Nuremberg trial. There might have been some that have been bribed with cigarettes or something, but I never ran across any of them. Does that answer your question?
They probably were afraid to be comforting to you.
Oh, I think so. That's a good point, and I should have mentioned that. I mean, if they'd been caught, you know what would have happened? They would probably be shot on the spot. Yes?
You were essentially raised in a secular environment, and suddenly now you're being persecuted because you're Jewish, and now you're doing this excellent work for Jewish organizations. What happened to your religious affiliation feelings? Did you become more Jewish, or are you culturally involved? What happened to you in that regard?
I appreciate you asking that. I'm often getting that. Things basically haven't changed. I'm basically the same. I married a Christian, and I don't go to synagogue. I will occasionally go to church with my wife. My wife and I decided early on, if we had any children, that they would be brought up in the Christian faith.
But you bear witness doing this.
Pardon me?
But you do this, which is wonderful.
Oh yeah. Yes. I mean, this is my major mission, and I keep track of the number of groups I talk to, and it's amazing. But I started in October. In October would be 3 years ago, and I covered about 100 groups, close to 10,000 people. So it's very, very important to me, and this is the way, that's my way of giving back. Yes?
Those groups, are they more elderly groups like ours? Because you really need to be talking to those younger people.
Oh,
We are aware.
Yes,
You know.
you are aware, but mostly I talk to students. I talk to, no, I talk to mostly to students, but I don't like not to be occupied during the summer vacation. So that's when I talk to several. And I seem to be talking to more and more organizations here about it. And I'll talk to anybody, anytime, because it's important to me. What I always say to the student, if people say, oh, it never happened, don't believe it, just tell them you go with a survivor and you heard the survivor talk.
Where did you pick up English?
I picked up English
Could you
in
repeat
school.
the questions?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I should, yeah. What was your question? I should have repeated that. I'm sorry, what was your question? Yeah, you just had the question. No, earlier you had a question.
Oh. No, go ahead, I don't know what you were.
Oh, okay. Please ask the question again.
Where did you pick up English?
Oh, where did I pick up English? Yeah, I will repeat. Where did I pick up English? I learned English in school, but you know, if you can think back to your days in school when you learned a foreign language, you really don't learn it until you get to the country. So I spent time in England, and that's probably where I learned it. Yes?
Steen, can you talk a little bit about what happened with your mother and you after you were liberated and moved on, how you lived and so on?
Yes. The question was, how did my mother and I live after we were liberated? Most of the family expected us to go to Copenhagen since my father had passed away. My mother had good friends in Odense, and quite frankly, she wanted to get away from the family, and she wanted to bring me up her way. So we went back there. Didn't have the income from my father anymore. My mother had to go to work. We did get some financial assistance from the government. I don't know how much it was, I really don't, but it certainly wasn't enough. My mother initially worked in a factory, not mica, but a different kind of factory. And her background was shorthand. Of course, everybody here, I'm sure, knows what shorthand is. When I talk to students, I have to explain what shorthand is. And her background was taking shorthand and translating letters into English and German and French even. And that's what she did before she got married. She also spent some time in England. So she got a job doing that, and she loved doing it. That's really... So we tried to live as normal life as we could. And as I said, we didn't talk much about our experiences. And we would go to Copenhagen at the holidays. And I know I and my wife always said, "Sorry, your family was quite a mixture, but we celebrated Christmas." And I know there are other Jewish people that celebrate Christmas also. I'm not saying that's right, but that's what we did. We would go to Copenhagen, and my mother got remarried in 51, and I went to commercial school in Copenhagen. My mother stayed in Odense to continue to work. She loved playing duplicate bridge, and she taught us bridge at the high school. And I played in high school, and then I didn't really start playing again until I retired. But what else can I tell you? Does that cover it all? Okay, thank you. Yes?
Your mother passed away?
My mother passed away in 1996. She was 90 years old. And I like to think there's some good genes. I have some good genes. And she was amazed after what she went through. I mean, I cannot imagine what it would be like not only to be in camp, but being without her husband when she was 38 years young. And And she was amazed she lived that long. And she didn't hear very well, and part of it, she had an operation before the war, but there was some heavy bombardment in the camp, and she lost her hearing for a week, but fortunately came back. But she played a lot of duplicate bridge like I do, and I was going to say, she didn't really, I mean, we talked about it, but not to any great extent, and I wish we had talked more about it. But very interesting, a year before she died, there was some young journalist in Denmark that interviewed her. And I'm fortunate I have those tapes, and I've learned a lot from those tapes and used part of that information in my talk and in my book. And she opened up as never before, and it was amazing, but I think she knew she didn't have much time to live, and wanted to make sure that she would pass on the word. I mean, I'm sometimes asked, why didn't I do this earlier? You have to, the time has to be right, you have to feel it's right, and I think you get more reflexive as you get older. So I felt the time was right when I started my book. Can I just relate, I just want to relate, I get tremendous questions from the students, especially at middle school. And the other day, I think that was a high schooler, but it was a 9th grader. So that must be, yeah, that would be high school. He came up to me, it was down in Florida. I spend my winters in Florida. It gets too cold for me up here on there, and I talk down there also. And he came up to me afterwards very quietly and said, did you do any dating in Thereisienstad? Or was there any dating in Thereisienstad? I said, I'm sure there was some, but I don't believe there was very much. So he said, did you date? So I said, I don't know about you, but when I was 9 years old, I'd love to have more questions if there are any. Yes.
You mentioned forgiveness and closure.
Yes.
And are you a forgiving person? Did you forgive the Germans?
No, I'll never forgive the Nazis. There's a big difference between the Germans and Nazis, but I'm sure, no, I could never forgive them.
What do you mean by closure?
By closure, I think it helps to talk about it, get it out in the open. And I learned a lot about it, and I would hate to go to my grave without having all that information. I think that helps me a great deal. Yes?
What brought you to the States, and what have you thought about, like, our awareness of the Holocaust, and, like, how has that changed a lot over the years, at least here?
What brought me to the United States, and what is the awareness of Holocaust in the United States? I believe there was very little awareness of Holocaust for decades after the war. If you disagree, let me know. I think that awareness increased in after the Eichmann trial. I think it was in 1962. The young man here, actually, who asked the question, is an intern with the Holocaust Museum from Washington, or works in the Highland Park Museum, and I thank you for asking. But it seems to me that after the Eichmann trial, it started picking up, and I think there's much greater awareness of it the last decades or so. Like the museum in Washington is 20 years young, really. The museum in Skokie is 5 years young. The museum in Naples is 10 years young. So there's a lot more awareness of it, and I like to add to that awareness because I think that's important. Do you have any feeling about it?
I mean, I think I'm too young to know, like,
okay.
what it was like. I was just really curious to know, like, if you felt that anybody could even talk to you about your experience when you first moved here, and it sounds like they couldn't.
They didn't talk about it. I didn't talk about it. If somebody had asked me, I would have answered them. It was not a secret. I would have asked them, but I wouldn't bring it up.
I feel like in my generation, like we are, at least, I mean, I grew up in Glencoe, a very Jewish town, but I think that there's pretty much complete awareness, and at my university. That's good.
It's interesting you mention that, and I'm sure from your perspective you're right. Can I take a few minutes to explain that? On YouTube, some months ago, there was a daughter of a Holocaust survivor who went to Pennsylvania, and she interviewed students from the University of Pennsylvania, Drexel, and several other universities. And she asked them very basic questions. Who was Hitler? When did the Holocaust take place? What was Auschwitz? Not a single student from a university could answer those questions, which is hard for me to understand. So eventually there were questions asked of some students, and they could answer it perfectly. What was the big difference? The difference was that the people that could answer the question, they went to school in one of the 5 or now 6 states, one of the 5 states that has mandatory Holocaust education. Illinois is one, Florida is one, California, New Jersey, New York. And would you believe, as a result of that YouTube, Pennsylvania now have mandatory education in the Holocaust. But it's just shocking. Have you seen it?
No. I'm not shocked because I go to Tulane in New Orleans.
Yes.
There's a lot of Jews there, first of all. And it's a lot of Illinois and New York people. So that would be why I feel like...
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. But that makes a big difference. Anne, who's not here, she's busy in the kitchen. We're both overwhelmed with the turnout here today, and she's very interested. Would you mind telling me, maybe just in a few words, why you came today? I know she would be very interested in that. I don't know if you want to ask her to come in. She may be busy. Anybody wants to? Yes?
My heritage is all 4 of my grandparents are from Denmark. And so in '58, I went to Denmark to learn the language. And my roommate told me about the Germans coming through her town. Her father owned a tobacco shop. And they came in, they stole everything. And they were in the apartment above, looking out a bay window at how they were marching, and they were so terrified. And then she told, when the war was over, these pathetic young German boys, without shoes, hardly clothed, walking back to Germany. We went to Germany, it's too long a story, but we went to Germany, and her preference would have been, there was another Danish girl along, would have been to have gone all the way and not even stop. They were still afraid of Germans. And they weren't Jewish.
Mm. You speak Danish?
Det gør jeg godt.
Vældig godt.
Jeg ønsker at høre din dialekt.
Yes.
Jeg kan kende det.
Yeah. So you know where I'm from then.
Ja, det gør jeg.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Anybody else want to share why they came today? Yes.
I'll just tell a little, after I finished college, I went to Germany, and I worked there for the United States in decarbonization and industrial deconcentration. They considered this one of the aims of the lost the name of the plan, suburbs of Berlin, for the summer of 45 in the conference. Well, I'm sorry, I don't want to make a speech. But at any rate, I had an interesting life as a result, and led to many other interesting times. That's enough.
Thank you for sharing.
My German is not good, but I get along.
Okay. Yes.
You had mentioned education in Illinois. My daughter is a teacher at the mid school, Deer Path Mid School.
Which school? Which school?
Deer Path.
Oh, Deer Path, yes.
In Lake Forest.
Yes.
And a month ago or 2 months ago, they did a special presentation for 2 days. And they had all the children come in. Well, she was one of the teachers who did this. And they had read so much about the nutrition and things. Of course, she teaches nutrition there. And what they did, they got enough books so they knew exactly how many ounces of this and this. And they had all these classes come in. They had tables set up. And she had little paper cups. And this is how much food they had here and there. And the children were astounded. They said, "Is this it?" And she said, "Yes, this is what breakfast and lunch and dinner," and it just brought that to them. And they were doing it in Illinois. Well, at least they were doing it in Lake Forest. They had 2 days of special, instruction.
That's
I
great.
thought it was unbelievable.
That's great. Tell your daughter if they needed survivors and soaps and students, I like to be there.
One of the few things that Illinois has done right.
Yes?
I had a question still. Were you part of the Spielberg project where Steven Spielberg met?
No, I was not. I've been interviewed, videoed by I don't know if anybody could hear, but was I part of the Spielberg project. Skokie Museum, I've been interviewed, and they had a video, and also down in Florida. I contacted the Shoah Foundation in Los Angeles, and I didn't hear from them, and I sent them, and I'm pretty stubborn, maybe tenacious, and I sent them another email, and I don't know what's going to happen. I did get a phone call from somebody, but no, I haven't. I believe they had about 50,000, something like that.
But don't you think that this is important for history purposes?
Oh, absolutely.
For young people?
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. But I can, I mean, they never recognized my email, and I even pursued it. But Skokie has done it with a number of survivors, and so has Naples. And I think the museum in, I believe the museum in Washington has, Yes?
I spent my life working with children's books, and back in the 70s there were quite a few books written for elementary school children. One was called Number the Stars, North to Freedom, and When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit, and various books written for kids that age. And so I've been quite aware of all of this. And I've been to the Norwegian Resistance Museum, but I have been in Denmark also.
Yeah,
because
it's
I learned
interesting.
Danish.
Yeah. Oh, good. Number of Stars took place. It took place in Denmark.
Right.
I should remember. And just 2 weeks ago, I was at the Resistance Museum in Oslo.
Oh, really?
Yes, yes. It's actually less than 2 weeks ago. But I want to thank all of you for coming, and I really appreciate you being here today. And please don't forget to pass on the word. And I want to thank Marla for having me here today. It's very important for me. And I